Long ago and far away there lived a rich and powerful Tsar. And in the Tsar's kingdom there was a very fine archer whose name was Ivan. And Ivan had a horse, but such horses are not to be seen these days. These were horses of power, and they lie beneath the earth, buried. And it is said that in the very last days, when the existence of the entire world is in jeopardy, that those horses will arise from their graves where they have been buried. They will be mounted by the knights who were buried with them, and they will save the world. But that is a different story for a different time. In this story, Ivan the archer was riding through the forest one beautiful spring day. It was a lovely day. The sky was blue, there were white puffy clouds, the sun was shining, flowers were blooming, little forest creatures like squirrels and rabbits were hopping through the underbrush. Birds were singing. Oh, wait, that's wrong. The birds were not singing. No birds were singing. There was nary a tweet. And that was odd, because on a day like that, you would expect birds to be singing. Ivan noticed the silence, and he said to himself, the only possible reason that the birds are quiet is that the beautiful and powerful Firebird has just come this way. And that indeed proved to be true, because turning a bend in the path, Ivan saw on the ground a feather, just one feather, but it was beautiful. It shone and sparkled in the sunlight as though it were made of pure gold, which in fact it was. Ivan dismounted and went to pick up the feather, and the horse spoke. The horse said, "Leave the feather." "What?" said Ivan. "I said, leave the feather. If you take that feather, you will soon know the meaning of fear." "No," said Ivan. "I'm going to take the feather because I'm going to take it to the Tsar. It is amazing and unique. Nobody else has a feather like it. The Tsar will be thrilled, and he will no doubt reward me wonderfully." "Huh? Whatever," said the horse. Because, Ivan didn't listen to his horse. Who listens to horses? A horse is a horse, of course, but nobody listens to horses. So Ivan took the feather the next day to the Tsar. And when the Tsar saw that feather, his eyes widened with delight. And then they narrowed with greed. And he said to Ivan, "How dare you dishonor me in this way?" "No dishonor, your majesty," said Ivan. "You bring me a single feather? Bring me the entire bird." "But, your majesty..." "Bring me the entire bird, or your head will no longer be acquainted with your shoulders." "Yes, your majesty," said Ivan. And he went out to the courtyard where he'd left his horse. "So, how'd that go for you, Ivan?" "You were right. This is the worst. The Tsar tells me to bring him the entire bird." "Well, it's not the worst, and yet the worst may come. But only go back to the Tsar and tell him that he must have 100 of his servants, take 100 bags of corn, and scatter it in the nearby field at midnight." This Ivan did, and at midnight, sure enough, there were 100 servants scattering 100 bags of corn. Just before dawn, Ivan arrived on the horse of power. He climbed a tree with very thick foliage, and the horse began to meander through the field, nibbling on grass. But just before the rosy fingers of dawn had showed their rosy fingertips, there was a great whoosh, and there was the Firebird. Magnificent, glorious. The Firebird landed in the field and began to eat the grain. And Ivan stayed hidden, and the horse of power kept meandering through the field until he came very close to the Firebird, and then in a swift motion he pinned down the Firebird's outstretched wing with one of his powerful hoofs. It came down so hard that the very earth shook. Well, then Ivan jumped out of the tree, and he tied up the Firebird with a stout rope which he had brought for that very purpose. The next morning Ivan returned to the Tsar's palace, and he gave the Tsar the Firebird. When the Tsar saw it, his eyes widened with delight and pleasure, and then they narrowed with greed. "Ah," he said, "and if you can do that, I know that you can get me the woman that I intend to marry." "And who is that?" said Ivan. "It is the beautiful Princess Vasilisa." "And where can she be found?" "Ah, in the thrice ninth kingdom, in the thrice 10th tsardom, in the land of Never. And you must get her for me, or your head will no longer—" I think I know this part," said Ivan. He went back out to the horse. The horse said, "So did the Tsar like the Firebird?" "Oh, the Firebird! The Tsar loved the Firebird. But now he commands me to get him the Princess Vasilisa as his bride. This is the worst." "No," said the horse, "it is not the worst, and yet the worst may come. But only go back in and ask the Tsar to give you a golden tent with a golden roof and silver walls and hangings and enough food and drink for a feast." This Ivan did, and soon he and the horse of power were on their way past the thrice ninth kingdom and the thrice 10th tsardom to the land of Never, where the blue sky meets the blue ocean and the golden sand and the green forest. And there Ivan looked out at the sea, and he could see Vasilisa. She was rowing along in a golden rowboat. She was rowing with silver oars, and he could hear that she was singing something. "Row, row, row your boat." Yeah, it sounded like that anyway. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had imagined, truly a feast for the eyes. But Ivan had no time to stop and stare, because he had a tent to pitch and a banquet to set out. But soon the tent was pitched, the banquet was spread out on banquet tables, and back in the sea, Vasilisa was finished with her rowing. She brought her small boat into shore, and she was surprised to see a tent. She was pretty sure it hadn't been there when she started out that morning, but it was a beautiful tent, and she went up to it and lifted the tent flap, and there was a young man, rather handsome, lounging on pillows, eating peeled grapes or some such. And there was a banquet table laden with all sorts of food, the finest meats, the richest sauces, the most exotic fruits and vegetables, and beverage to match. "Oh, hi," said Ivan. "I've been expecting you. So you must be hungry and thirsty after that workout." "Oh, I am," said Vasilisa. "Well, I was just about to whip myself up a whey protein shake, but this looks much better." "Trust me," said Ivan, "it is." And so they ate and drank and ate and drank and ate and drank. And finally Vasilisa said, "Ah, even though it is only noon, my eyelids feel as heavy as if it were midnight." And in a few minutes she was sound asleep there on the cushions in the tent. And she was even more beautiful asleep than awake. She didn't even snore. But Ivan was a gallant man. He picked her up gently and put her gently on his horse. Then he gathered up the tent and put the leftover banquet items in some takeout containers he brought for the purpose. And soon Ivan and Vasilisa and the tent and the leftovers, they were on their way back to the Tsar's palace. They were going rather fast, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a mighty locomotive. I don't think they were leaping any buildings, but they were there in no time. And Ivan set down Vasilisa. Oh, when the Tsar took a look at her, his eyes widened with delight. Now, the whole place was obviously ready for a big celebration of some sort. There was confetti, there were streamers, there were trumpeters. And when Ivan arrived with Vasilisa, the Tsar said, "Cue the trumpets." And the trumpets began to play the wedding march. Well, of course, with all of this commotion, Vasilisa awoke. She rubbed her eyes and she said, "Where am I? What's happening?" And the Tsar said, "Oh, you're just in time for the wedding." "Wedding?" she said. "I love weddings. Who's getting married?" "Oh," said the Tsar, You and me." She looked at him. He was not young, and his eyes were not kind. And she said, I cannot marry you. Oh, yes, you can, said the Tsar, and you will. I cannot marry you until I have my dress. Oh, a dress, is that all? We have designers and couturiers here at the palace. They will whip you up something fabulous in no time. No, said Vasilisa, I don't want just any dress. I want the dress. I've already said yes to the dress, and you must get it for me if you expect me to marry you. And where would we find this dress? Said the Tsar. Oh, it is at the bottom of the sea, back in the land of Never. It's in a golden casket with a large rock on top. Well, the Tsar turned to his go-to guy, Ivan, and said, get me the dress or your head. He said, I know. I'm on my way. He went back out to the stable. So how's it going, Ivan? Now we've got to go get the wedding dress. Back to the land of Never, back past the thrice ninth kingdom, the thrice 10th tsardom, to the sea. Soon they were on their way, speeding bullet, mighty locomotive, And they got to the place where the blue sky and the blue sea meet the golden land and the green forest. And Ivan dismounted, and the horse of power began to walk down the beach until it came to a lobster. But this was no ordinary lobster. Oh no, this was a huge lobster, the giant of lobsters, the king of lobsters, the Tsar of lobsters. And in what was becoming a signature move, suddenly the horse of power brought down his powerful hoof on the lobster's tail, again shaking the ground. The lobster shrieked and screamed, and if you've ever cooked a live lobster, you know they can do that, and said, let me go. But Ivan said, no, we can't let you go until you get a dress for us. It's in a golden casket held down by a rock at the bottom of the sea. Let me go, said the lobster. I'll get you the dress. No, said Ivan, we're not that foolish. You get the dress. Well, the lobster let out a call, and soon the sea was roiling with lobsters. They came up onto the sand, and the Tsar of lobsters told them that he needed that golden casket underneath the rock at the bottom of the sea. And soon all those lobsters, his hench lobsters, they disappeared and came back with the casket. Well, Ivan thanks the lobsters, and the horse of power released the lobster's tail. The lobster jumped back into the sea, of course, and Ivan took the golden casket and was on his way back to the Tsar's palace. When he got there, well, Vasilisa slipped into a nearby dressing room, and she slipped into the dress, and she looked more beautiful than ever. And now, said the Tsar, resume the trumpets. The wedding march, please. But before the trumpets could begin, Vasilisa said, there's just one more thing before I can marry you. And what is that? Said the Tsar. I wish for the man who brought me here to do penance by leaping into a pot of boiling water. Ivan gasped. But the Tsar, he was not displeased. After all, he had seen the looks that passed between Ivan and Vasilisa. So he commanded a large pot to be brought in, and filled with water, and a fire lit underneath it, and that was done. And then they all watched the pot to see if it would boil, but of course that watched pot never boils. Well, Ivan took that opportunity to ask the Tsar if he could go back out to the courtyard and say goodbye to his horse, and well, the Tsar thought that was okay. He said it's probably the last time you'll be seeing each other. And so Ivan went out to the courtyard, and the horse of power said, and now what, Ivan? Ivan said, well, this is goodbye, old pal. You've been a perfect friend. And he told him that he was required to be thrown into a pot of boiling water. This is the worst, he said. You could be right, said the horse. But who ordered this? Well, that's the thing, said Ivan. It was Vasilisa who suggested it, and I thought she liked me. Oh, in that case, said the horse, you may have a chance after all. Really, said Ivan. You've got a plan? You've got a suggestion of how I can save myself? Well, I do have a suggestion. When the Tsar's servants grab you to throw you in the pot of water, push them away and, and, said Ivan, and run and jump into the pot of your own volition. Really, said Ivan, that's the best you can do? Yeah, best I can do. Sorry. Good luck. Well, Ivan went back into the throne room. The watched pot was finally boiling, which the Tsar noticed. But Vasilisa said, I'm not certain that has come to a full rolling boil. I need to check. So she went over to the pot and she passed her hand through the steam. And some people say that when she did, she dropped something from her hand, though I don't know if that can be verified. And then the Tsar's servants went to grab Ivan, but he pushed them away. He ran and jumped into the pot, and blah, 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 he disappeared below the surface of the water. And then he rose up out of the water, good as new. Well, actually, better than new. His hair was thicker, his eyes were bluer, his muscles were musclier. He looked great, which Vasilisa noticed. And in fact, so did the Tsar. And the Tsar, saying to himself, if it could do that for him, think of what it could do for me. And so the Tsar ran and jumped into the pot of boiling water and was boiled to death instantly. Well, Ivan and Vasilisa, they buried the Tsar, but then they looked around and everything had been so beautifully arranged for a wedding, it would have been a shame to let it all go to waste. And so there was a wedding after all. Ivan and Vasilisa were married, and he became the Tsar and she became the Tsarevna, and they ruled long and wisely and well. And as for the horse of power, he spent the rest of his days in a golden stable, which was a fitting reward, because after all, that horse had been responsible for the whole thing.